They called him Varg. The name was never spoken above a whisper inside the black rock walls of Todd's citadel. Not by the guards who slept with silver daggers tucked beneath their pillows, not by the handlers who had learned, through the loss of fingers and worse, that a whip was the only language the beast respected. Varg. A word that tasted of iron and old terror, a word that meant the end of things. He was a creature assembled from the Northern Kingdom's darkest fears, a wolf so immense his shoulders brushed the tops of the iron-barred gate when he paced, his fur the absolute black of a sky scrubbed clean of every star. His eyes burned amber in the torchlight, but not with the warmth of fire. With the heat of something ancient and ungovernable, something that had been chained so long it had forgotten what it felt like to be free and hated the world for the reminder. He had crippled 2 handlers in his first year, killed a 3rd in his second. After that, the Alpha Kings stopped replacing them. No one entered the Kennel of Shadows willingly. No one, until her. Alpha King Todd stood motionless in the arched mouth of the kennel corridor, one gauntleted hand braced against the damp stone wall, the torch in his other fist guttering in a draft that smelled of wet rock and pine resin. The flame threw long, unsteady shadows across his face, a face carved for authority, jaw set like a fortress gate, dark eyes that had stared down warlords and high councils without flinching a single degree. He was armored even now, long after the evening meal, the dark plate over his chest engraved with the crowned wolf sigil of his bloodline, a fur-lined cloak hanging from shoulders broad enough to carry 3 centuries of iron-handed rule. He had come to check the chains. He did this sometimes, alone, in the hours when his citadel believed him asleep. It was the one ritual he had never delegated, the quiet, grim assurance that Varg's bindings held, that the nightmare he carried in his bloodline remained contained. It was not tenderness that brought him here, it was vigilance. It was the fundamental arithmetic of power. Know where your most dangerous weapon is at all times. He had not expected to find someone already inside. He had certainly not expected this. The girl was seated cross-legged on the cold, wet stone as though it were a sun-warmed hillside, and she had nowhere else she'd rather be. Her dark hair fell in thick, practical braids over the shoulders of a travel-worn, earth-toned tunic, the rough clothing of someone who had been handed a servant's bundle and told not to ask questions. She was slight, young, radiating the kind of quiet energy that had no business existing in a place like this, a warmth so out of place in the damp dark of the kennel that Leon's first irrational thought was that someone had smuggled a lantern inside and hidden it beneath her ribs. She had a length of knotted rope in her hands. The other end of the rope was in Varg's jaws. Leon's heart did not so much stop as seize, a fist closing around the muscle, squeezing. His breath became a thing he had to consciously manage, because Varg, his Varg, the creature that had not allowed a human hand within arm's reach in living memory, the beast whose amber eyes had never once reflected anything softer than the promise of destruction, was pulling, gently. The massive black head swung from side to side with the rope, and the girl laughed, a sound so small and genuine inside that cavernous dark that it rang against the stone walls like a dropped coin in an empty cathedral. "You think you're strong," she said, as though reporting a fascinating discovery. Her braids swung as she leaned back against the rope's resistance, her smile unguarded and completely, incomprehensibly unafraid. "You absolute menace. You're not going to win, you know. I have excellent grip strength." Varg pulled. The girl slid 6 inches across the stone floor on the seat of her trousers, laughing harder. Leon did not breathe. He had stood on a battlefield at 17, with an enemy sword pressed against his throat, and he did not feel what he felt now. This vertiginous, foundational wrongness, the sensation of watching a law of nature simply decline to apply. Varg did not play. Varg did not exercise restraint. The jaws that were holding that rope with the careful, deliberate gentleness of a mother carrying a newborn were the same jaws that removed a handler's arm at the elbow without apparent effort. The girl gave one enormous heave on the rope, and Varg, inexplicably, let her win. She toppled backward with the slack, catching herself on her palms with another laugh, the rope bundled against her chest. She sat up, grinning, cheeks flushed with exertion and something that looked dangerously like delight. "Ha! There it is. I knew you had some play in you." And then she held the rope out, offering it back. And Varg, the beast of the Northern Territories, the creature that had made grown warriors weep with relief when they cleared his corridor without incident, dropped his head. Not to strike, not to take. The enormous black wolf lowered his massive skull until his chin nearly brushed the stone, ears soft, amber eyes half-lidded, and laid his head gently beside her. A bow. Leon's torch nearly fell from his hand. In 300 years, in 3 centuries of carrying this beast like a second skeleton inside his own chest, feeling Varg's rage like a tide he was always bracing against, always managing, always afraid of, he had never once felt what moved through their soul link in this moment. It was not rage. It was not the usual black churning hunger that Leon spent every waking hour suppressing. It was something quieter and more devastating than any of that. It was rest. The beast was resting. The girl reached out without a moment's hesitation and scratched behind Varg's ear, her fingers disappearing into the coarse black fur with the easy confidence of someone who had done this 100 times, except Leon knew with iron certainty that she had not, because he would have known. He would have felt it through the link. Would he have? The question arrived like a blade slipping between armor plates. Would he have felt it? In recent nights, he had noticed something different threading through the constant dark noise of Varg's presence, something quieter, something almost like silence. He had attributed it to the season, to fatigue, to any number of things that were not this, not her. Leon pressed himself flatter against the stone of the archway, watching his own monster close its eyes under a girl's gentle hand, and felt something coil cold and unfamiliar in the center of his chest. He was a king who ruled through iron and whip and the sheer gravitational force of his authority. He understood power in all its forms, the power of threat, of alliance, of strategic mercy. He did not understand this. He did not have a category for a girl who walked into the Kennel of shadows and befriended the apocalypse and laughed while she did it. He did not understand why, for the first time in 3 centuries, Varg's side of the soul link felt like an open window instead of a locked vault. He stood in the shadows long after she had settled back against the kennel wall, still talking softly to the beast as though it were the most natural conversation in the world, telling Varg about the color of the sky above the northern ridge at dawn and whether he'd ever seen snow that fell sideways, and if he thought the kitchen staff would notice if she borrowed another heel of bread. Varg's tail, that thick, powerful appendage that had only ever moved to balance a lunge, thumped once against the stone. Then again. A wag. Leon Todd, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, undefeated in 3 centuries of dominance, turned away from the kennel archway before the girl could look up and find a king standing in the dark, undone by a sound as simple and shattering as a monster learning for the first time to wag its tail. He walked back through the corridor with the torch held loose in his grip, and the unfamiliar cold thing still coiled in his chest, and he understood 2 things with a clarity that frightened him. He would be back tomorrow night, and this girl, this laughing, fearless, completely impossible girl, was going to change everything. You felt that, didn't you? There's something about a soul that's been locked away for centuries and the one person brave enough to reach for it that hits different. If you're here, you already know this story is yours. If Lillian's fearlessness moved something in you, if you felt Leon's world crack open in that corridor, then you're exactly who this story was made for. Drop a wolf in the comments and tell me, did you feel it when the tail wagged? Because I need to know I'm not the only one. Subscribe and turn on notifications. This pack doesn't leave anyone behind, and the next chapter is coming fast. Share this with someone who needs a story that reminds them that the fiercest things bow to the gentlest hearts. We're just getting started, and trust me, you do not want to miss what Leon does next. The lunar stone had been in the Fowler family's keeping for 4 generations, A palm-sized disk of pale, veined rock that caught moonlight and held it the way water holds heat, glowing faintly long after the source had set. It was sacred. It was irreplaceable. And on the morning of the autumn muster, when the High Elder's representatives arrived at the Fowler estate to confirm its safekeeping, it was gone. Lillian knew before the search party reached her room. She knew the way you know a storm is coming before the first cloud appears. Something in the air shifts, something goes quiet that shouldn't be quiet, and the hairs on your arms stand at attention. She was in the herb garden behind the main house, her hands dark with soil, replanting the winter sage that the frost had nearly taken, when she heard her sister's voice carry across the courtyard, clear, composed, perfectly, surgically grief-stricken. "I saw her near the stone chamber last night. I didn't want to believe it. She's my sister." Cora Fowler had their mother's cheekbones and their father's talent for knowing exactly which words would draw blood and exactly the right order. She was standing in the center of the courtyard when Lillian came around the garden wall, her pale dress immaculate, her dark eyes already wet with the kind of tears that cost her nothing to manufacture. Flanking her were two of the High Elder's men in their gray ceremonial mantles, and behind them, her father, standing at the precise angle that communicated both authority and plausible distance should things go poorly. Lillian looked at her sister's carefully arranged face and understood everything in the span of a breath. Cora wanted the Fowler seat. She wanted the Elder Council's favor. She wanted the introduction to Alpha King Leon Todd that a high-profile act of loyalty would purchase, and she needed Lillian gone to get all three, because Lillian had the one thing Cora couldn't manufacture: the instinctive trust of every creature, human or otherwise, that crossed her path. Their father's hunting dogs followed Lillian through the house and ignored Cora entirely. The pack wolves of the border outpost, normally skittish around strangers, had pressed their heads into Lillian's hands the one time she'd accompanied her father to the muster grounds. Small things, noticed things, the kind of things that made people in positions of power take a second, longer look. Cora could not afford a second look landing anywhere near her younger sister. The search of Lillian's room turned up the lunar stone wrapped in cloth beneath her mattress, placed there, she had no doubt, sometime in the early hours while she slept. She said so, clearly and without tears, standing in the center of her own room with soil still under her fingernails and her chin level. It didn't matter. The stone was in her room. Her sister had wept beautifully in the courtyard. Her father had angled himself precisely right. The sentencing took less than an hour. Banishment to the Alpha King's Citadel, sacrificial servitude in the kennels of the damned, effective immediately, before the autumn muster concluded, before any appeals could be lodged, before the ink was even dry on the transfer document that her father signed with the steady hand of a man releasing something he'd already decided wasn't worth the trouble. They gave her 20 minutes to gather what she could carry. She packed her herb kit, small, worn leather, a tight roll of dried plants and folded linen bandages she kept out of habit, a spare tunic, her mother's wooden comb, the only thing of her mother's she still had. She stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, looking at the narrow bed and the frost-killed sage visible through the window, and the life she had built in the margins of a family that had never quite made room for her, and she made a decision, quiet and private and entirely her own. She was not going to spend whatever time she had left being afraid. She had never found much use in it anyway. The citadel rose from the northern ridge like something the mountain had grown, rather than something men had built, a mass of black rock and iron that absorbed the gray afternoon sky rather than reflecting it, its towers blunt and graceless in the way of things designed purely for function rather than impression. It didn't need to be beautiful. It needed to be permanent. It needed to communicate to anyone approaching along the ridge road that the power housed inside it had never once found reason to apologize for itself. Lillian looked at it through the slats of the transport cart and thought it looked exactly like a place that needed better drainage and probably smelled of damp stone. She was not wrong on either count. Mistress Thorne was waiting in the inner courtyard. She was a tall woman, angular and precise in the way of someone who has arranged themselves so thoroughly around efficiency that warmth has simply been crowded out. Her iron-gray hair was coiled flat against her head, her dark dress was without a single unnecessary fold, and she looked at Lillian the way a person looks at a delivery that has arrived in the wrong size. "Fowler," she said, not as a greeting, but as a confirmation of something unfortunate. She had a ledger open in one hand and a quill in the other, and she ran her gaze down Lillian from the travel-dusty braids to the worn boots without any particular change in expression. "Kennel duty, effective tonight," she said. "I was told." Lillian stepped down from the cart, her herb kit slung across one shoulder. "Is there somewhere I can wash before—" "You'll wash after." Mistress Thorne made a small notation in her ledger with the finality of someone closing a door. "If there's an after." She looked up then, and something shifted in her expression. Not cruelty exactly, more the specific flatness of someone delivering information they consider a professional courtesy rather than a kindness. "The kennel assignment is not a position from which people typically require orientation. You'll be given a torch, a bucket, and access to the lower corridor. The previous 3 handlers are no longer available to advise you. I trust you understand the implication." "I do," Lillian said. "You'll be kibble by morning," Mistress Thorne said, with the same tone she might use to report a change in the meal schedule, and turned and walked back toward the main keep without looking back. Lillian stood alone in the courtyard for a moment, the wind off the northern ridge moving through her braids, and the citadel rising black and enormous around her on 3 sides. Somewhere deep inside the rock, something shifted, a low, resonant sound, not quite a growl, that moved through the stone beneath her boots more than through the air. She picked up her herb kit, adjusted the strap, and went to find the lower corridor. The torch they gave her was barely adequate, a short, spluttering thing that threw more shadow than light, which meant that Lillian smelled the kennel before she saw it. Wet stone and animal, and something older beneath both of those things, something mineral and dark that she couldn't name. The corridor sloped downward, the walls narrowing and the ceiling dropping, iron rings bolted into the stone at intervals where chains had been attached and removed so many times the rock around them had been worn smooth. The gate at the end of the corridor was massive, black iron, 2 inches thick, the lock the size of her fist. Someone had slid back the bolt from outside, leaving the gate swung inward. An invitation or a formality. She wasn't sure there was a meaningful difference. She stepped inside. The kennel was a natural cavern enlarged by hand, its ceiling lost in darkness above the torch's reach, its far walls suggesting themselves in shadow rather than declaring their position. The floor was rough stone, damp in places, scattered with old straw that had long since given up any ambition of being clean. Chains of extraordinary thickness were bolted to the near wall, 3 sets, each link as wide as her palm, 2 of them broken in ways that suggested significant force had been applied from the inside. The 3rd chain ran into the dark, toward the far side of the cavern. Lillian held her torch up and waited, because she was not going to walk toward a chain she couldn't trace to its end without knowing what was on the other end of it. She was brave, not foolish. There was a meaningful difference there, too. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, from the far dark, 2 points of amber light appeared, not moving, just watching. Lillian kept her torch steady and her breathing even, and she looked at those amber eyes in the dark, and she thought about the way her father's hunting dogs used to press into the corner of their kennels when they were new, hackles up, everything loud and defensive, every signal broadcasting threat, even when what they meant was, "I am frightened and I do not trust this place or you." She thought about how the worst thing you could do with an animal reading every signal you broadcast was broadcast the wrong ones. She sat down on the floor, cross-legged, her torch planted in a crack in the stone beside her, her herb kit in her lap. "Right," she said, to the amber eyes in the dark. "I'm going to be here for a while, so we should probably get used to each other." The amber eyes didn't move. "My name is Lillian. I know that doesn't mean anything to you, that's fine." She opened her herb kit and extracted the small parcel she'd packed from her own dinner, a hard heel of bread and a strip of dried meat that the transport cart's driver had handed her with the gruff awkwardness of someone performing an unexpected kindness. She'd been saving it. She set the meat on the stone in front of her, between herself and the dark, I also know you're not a puppy. I'm not confused about that. But I've found that everyone, regardless of what they look like on the outside, responds better to being spoken to than at. So, the amber eyes lowered very slightly. Not a threat, a shift in attention. I had a garden. Winter sage, mostly, and some yarrow along the south wall. The yarrow is nearly impossible to kill, which is the main reason I planted it. I find reliability comforting. She paused. I don't have the garden anymore. That's recent. I'm still getting used to it. The chain in the dark moved, a single slow drag of iron against stone. The amber eyes came closer, incrementally, the way an uncertain thing moves when it is deciding whether the risk of approach is worth what might be gained. Lillian kept still and kept talking. By the time the beast had crossed half the cavern, she had covered the weather on the ridge road, the specific texture of frost on yarrow leaves at dawn, and her professional opinion that the Citadel's outer courtyard would benefit substantially from a drainage channel along the eastern wall. By the time Varg's enormous dark shape resolved itself out of the shadow into something she could actually see in the torchlight, the staggering size of him, the absolute black of his fur, and the slow and deliberate way he moved, she had moved on to describing the exact quality of light in the northern sky just before sunrise, the way it went green before it went gold, and how she'd always thought that particular color was the most honest thing the sky ever did, because it wasn't trying to be beautiful yet, it was just trying to be true. Varg stopped at the edge of the torchlight, close enough that she could see the old wounds along his flank, scored lines through the fur where something had cut deep and healed badly, scar tissue pulling the skin at wrong angles. Close enough that she could see the careful, exhausted intelligence in those amber eyes that the dark had been hiding. He looked at the strip of dried meat on the stone. He looked at her. "Go ahead. I ate on the road." She hadn't, but he didn't need to know that. He took the meat with a delicacy that rearranged everything she might have assumed about a creature of her size, a careful, precise gentleness, the kind that requires more control, not less. He settled onto the stone with the weight of something that has been standing for a very long time, and finally, cautiously allowing itself to stop. Lillian reached into her herb kit and took out the yarrow she always carried. "Those cuts on your side look like they've been left to manage themselves, which I find personally offensive. We're going to do something about that." Varg watched her hands with those amber eyes and did not move away. Leon felt it 3 nights before he went to look. The soul link was a constant in his existence, a second current beneath his own pulse, Varg's presence the way a chronic wound is a presence, always there, always requiring management, the dull background noise of something that was never going to heal. He had learned to work around it like you learn to work around a bad knee, carefully, with adjustments so habitual they no longer registered as adjustments. The gate at the end of the corridor was massive, black iron, 2 inches thick, the lock the size of her fist. Someone had slid back the bolt from outside, leaving the gate swung inward. An invitation or a formality. She wasn't sure there was a meaningful difference. She stepped inside. It wasn't silence. Varg was never silent. Even in sleep, there was a restless, churning quality to the link, the sensation of something large pacing in a space too small for it. But this was different. This was the quality of air in a room after a window has been opened, still present, still full, but moving now, breathable in a way it hadn't been before. Leon lay in the dark of his chambers with his eyes open and his hand pressed flat against his sternum, feeling for the link, prodding it the way you probe a sore tooth. It remained quiet. He searched for the right word and arrived at one he hadn't applied to Varg in 3 centuries. Settled. He went on the 3rd night, alone, armed with a torch, using the servants' corridor that ran behind the kennel wall, so he arrived at the observation gap, a narrow slot in the stone originally cut for exactly this purpose, for watching the beast from a position of safety without being announced by the main gate. What he saw through that gap made him press one gauntleted fist against the wall for support. The girl was cleaning. Somehow, impossibly, she had procured a bucket. He would later discover she had talked one of the scullery boys out of it through a combination of cheerful persistence and a frankly unreasonable amount of charm, and she was washing the stones of Varg's side of the cavern with the calm, purposeful energy of someone engaged in meaningful work. Her braids were pinned up out of the way. She had rolled her sleeves to the elbow. She was also talking, because apparently she was always talking when Varg was present, and Varg was lying 5 feet away watching her with the alert, interested attention of a creature that has discovered something worth paying attention to. Leon watched his monstrous, unkillable, 3 centuries untamed wolf track a servant girl's movements around a bucket with the absorbed focus of a scholar studying primary sources. She wrung out the cloth, dunked it, wrung it again, and moved toward Varg's flank without preamble. Leon's hand tightened on the torch. Varg's ear rotated toward her approach, and then she pressed the warm, damp cloth against the scarred cuts along the beast's side, and Varg made a sound, low, not threatening, a sound Leon had never heard from him, a sound that landed somewhere in the chest rather than the spine, and leaned into it. "I know," the girl said quietly, working the cloth gently along the scar tissue. "It pulls wrong. The skin healed without enough support. I'm going to put some comfrey on it once I've cleaned it properly, and it won't fix the old damage, but it'll help the tension. You'll feel the difference by tomorrow." Varg turned his massive head and pressed his nose briefly against her knee. Leon stood at the observation gap and felt something happen to the wall between himself and his own chest, some internal architecture that had been standing for 300 years, developing in this moment the very first crack. Because he understood something suddenly that he had not understood before, watching this girl work her way methodically along Varg's damaged flank with a piece of cloth and a bucket and the complete, unhesitating confidence of someone who has decided a creature's suffering matters, regardless of whether that creature frightens anyone else. Every person who had ever approached Varg had approached the monster. The handlers with their whips had seen the monster. The soldiers who avoided the lower corridor had feared the monster. Even Leon himself, looking through the soul link, had only ever felt the monster, the rage and the darkness and the enormous, terrible energy of something that should not exist, being forced to persist anyway. This girl was not approaching a monster. She was approaching something in pain. The distinction was so simple and so devastating that Leon had to look away from the gap for a moment, pressing his back against the corridor wall with his torch held loose at his side, staring at the ceiling of the passage and breathing through something that had no adequate name yet. He went back every night after that. He told himself it was vigilance. He told himself it was strategic intelligence gathering, understanding the nature of the bond forming between the servant and the beast, assessing the security implications. He told himself many things, standing in that corridor in the dark after his citadel believed him asleep, watching through the gap as Lillian Fowler sat cross-legged on the cleaned stones of the kennel and talked to his monster about yarrow and ridge-light and drainage problems, Varg's great head in her lap and his tail making that soft, devastating thump against the floor. He stopped telling himself anything on the 6th night when Varg shifted in his sleep, a restless movement that Leon felt simultaneously through the link as a flicker of half-waking awareness, and Lillian put her hand on Varg's neck without looking up from the piece of cord she was braiding, an absent, instinctive, soothing touch, and the link went immediately, completely, achingly quiet again. And Leon stood in the dark of his corridor and understood that for 6 nights, while he had been watching her settle his monster, he had also been sleeping better than he had in 3 centuries. Not because of Varg, not entirely.
because of whatever Lillian Fowler carried inside her that she gave away so freely to lonely dogs and broken beasts and frost-killed gardens, without seeming to notice that it was extraordinary, without seeming to know that it was rare, without any apparent awareness that the Alpha King of the Northern Territories was standing in his own servants' corridor in the dark, night after night, drawn back by the specific gravity of watching someone treat his most terrible secret like it deserved, above all else, to be cared for. She braided her cord and kept her hand on Varg's neck and eventually began to hum, something low and rhythmic and shapeless that was not quite a song, and the beast breathed in slow and steady beside her, and Leon pressed his hand against the observation gap and felt the soul link move like an open window in summer, and thought that if this girl ever discovered he'd been watching, he would have absolutely no explanation that a king could offer with any dignity whatsoever. He stayed until the torch burned low. Then he walked back through the corridor, through his fortress, to his chambers, and lay in the dark with his hand against his sternum, feeling Varg's settled, dreaming presence in the link, full and warm and present in a way it had never been, and admitted to himself, in the complete privacy of his own sleeplessness, that Mistress Thorn had been catastrophically wrong. The girl was not going to be kibble by morning. The girl was going to be the end of everything he had built his 300 years of carefully maintained solitude upon. And somewhere deep in the kennel below, Varg's tail made one slow, sleepy thump against the stone, and the soul link carried it up through the fortress like a heartbeat, and Leon Todd, Alpha King, lay there and felt it land in the center of his chest like the first note of a song he had not known he was waiting to hear.
Cora arrived on a Tuesday, which Lillian would later think was very like her sister, choosing an ordinary day for an extraordinary cruelty, the way you slip a knife between ribs during a handshake rather than a duel. She came with an entourage of 6, a trunk of pale dresses, and a letter bearing the High Elder Balthazar's seal that formalized her introduction to Alpha King Leon Todd as a candidate for the Northern Alliance marriage. She swept into the Citadel's inner courtyard on a gray morning with her dark hair coiled immaculately and her chin at the precise angle that communicated she had already decided this place would be improved by her presence. Mistress Thorn received her with the rigid courtesy of someone who has learned to keep her opinions below the surface. The household staff assembled in a line along the courtyard wall, faces arranged into appropriate blankness. Lillian was at the end of the line, her braids pinned back, her earth-toned tunic clean. She had washed it in the kennel bucket the previous evening, which Varg had found interesting enough to supervise from approximately 2 feet away, his head tilted at the angle she had come to recognize as his considering things expression. Cora's eyes found her immediately. Of course they did. Cora had always had an instinct for locating Lillian in a room, the same way certain predators track movement at the edge of their vision. Something moved across her sister's face, there and gone, quick as a blink, that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but something blended uncomfortably between them. She had expected, Lillian understood, to arrive and be told that the kennel servant was no longer a concern. She had expected the problem to have resolved itself, the way problems sent to Varg's corridor tended to resolve. She had not expected Lillian to be standing in a line, upright, apparently healthy, and looking back at her with the same level, unsurprised expression she'd worn in their mother's garden the last time Cora had tried to make her feel small about something. The reception moved inside. Lillian returned to her duties. She was carrying herbs up from the lower stores, comfrey and calendula, a fresh supply for Varg's flank, which was healing with a speed that she was quietly proud of, when Cora found her in the corridor behind the great hall, alone, away from the household line, away from witnesses. The timing was not accidental. "You look terrible," Cora said pleasantly. It was the opening move of a familiar game. "You look exactly the same," Lillian said, which was true, and continued walking. Cora caught her arm. Her grip was harder than it needed to be, her fingers pressing to the point of deliberate discomfort, the particular grip of someone reminding you that they can. "You should be dead," she said, dropping the pleasant tone the way you drop a mask you're tired of holding. "I sent you somewhere you should not have survived. Why aren't you dead, Lillian?" Lillian looked at her sister's hand on her arm, then at her sister's face. "I made a friend," she said simply. The blow came fast, an open-handed strike aimed at her face, the kind Cora had perfected during their childhood as something that left no marks worth explaining. Lillian didn't have time to step back. She didn't need to. The sound that came from the lower corridor was not a growl. It was deeper than a growl, a frequency that bypassed the ear entirely and arrived directly in the sternum, a sound that rewired your instincts before your mind could weigh in. The iron gate at the corridor's end, which Lillian always left unlatched for exactly the ease of access it provided to her herb deliveries, swung open. And the chains, the extraordinary, double-linked iron chains that Mistress Thorne had assured the household on multiple occasions were rated to hold 3 times Varg's documented strength, came with him, because Varg came through the wall. Not the gate, the wall. The anchor bolts pulled free from the stone in a single convulsive lunge that brought a section of the kennel's upper wall with them, the chains hanging from his neck like broken jewelry, and he crossed the length of the lower corridor in the time it took Cora to process that the sound she had heard was real and was getting louder. He stopped between them. His shoulders filled the corridor from wall to wall. The broken chains dragged against the stone. His amber eyes were on Cora with an attention so complete and so focused that she went absolutely still the way small animals go still, every survival instinct firing simultaneously and arriving at the same unanimous conclusion. He did not advance, he simply stood. Lillian put her hand on the back of his neck, between his shoulders, and felt the deep vibration of him still moving through the muscle beneath her palm. Not rage, she had come to understand the difference. This was something older than rage. This was the particular quality of a creature that has decided, without ambiguity, where it belongs. "Cora," Lillian said quietly, "I think you should go back to your rooms." Cora went. Balthazar arrived at Leon's war table the following morning with his hands folded and his gray robes arranged in the specific configuration he deployed when he was about to say something that he had already decided could not be argued with. He was the oldest member of the High Elder Council, old enough that the pack's institutional memory lived primarily in his skull, and he wielded that longevity the way other men wielded swords, with the assumption that age is its own form of authority. "The kennel servant is practicing a parasitic bond," Balthazar said, without preamble. Leon looked up from the territorial maps he'd been reviewing. Across the table, his military commander, Roth, became very interested in his own hands. "Explain," Leon said.
Balthazar explained. He did it with the careful, structured logic of someone who has rehearsed, drawing on historical texts regarding manipulative bloodlines, the documented dangers of unsanctioned soul link interference, the theological position of the Elder Council on unauthorized connections to an alpha's wolf. He used words like contamination and corruption and weaponized empathy, and he arranged them in the order most likely to land in the gut of a king who had spent 3 centuries maintaining iron control over the most dangerous thing in the Northern Territories. What he did not say, but what sat underneath every word like bedrock, the beast had shattered a reinforced wall to protect a servant girl, and that meant the girl had more power over the Alpha King's wolf than the Alpha King did. And in Balthazar's 300-year-old cosmology, there was exactly one category for a woman who could do that. "She should be executed," he said, "before the Autumn Council, a public accounting to demonstrate that the pack's integrity remains intact. I recommend the courtyard, tomorrow at dawn." Leon sat very still. "She is healing the beast," he said. His voice was level. It was the voice he used in battle, when levelness itself was a form of control. "She is attaching the beast," Balthazar corrected, with the gentle certainty of someone explaining something to a person he considers compromised. "There's a difference, my king, between tending wounds and building chains of a different kind. The wolf that broke through a stone wall yesterday did not do so in service of the pack. It did so in service of her. An alpha's wolf serves one master." "It has never served me with that kind of loyalty," Leon said. The words came out quieter than he intended. Balthazar's eyes moved to him with something that might have been pity, if pity hadn't been a thing the High Elder considered a structural weakness. "No," Balthazar agreed, "it hasn't. Which should concern you more than it appears to." He gathered his robes. "Dawn, my king, before she does more damage than even you can undo." He left. Leon sat at the war table for a long time afterward, one hand pressed flat against the maps, and felt through the soul link the particular quality of Varg's presence. Open, settled, more present than it had been in centuries, and said nothing to the empty room. He gave no order to countermand the execution. It was the greatest failure of his 300-year reign, and he would spend a long time understanding why he had made it, because Balthazar's logic was dressed in the language of duty and pack integrity, and Leon had been a king long enough that duty-shaped arguments found the cracks in his judgment the way water finds the cracks in stone. Because some part of him was afraid, not of Lillian, but of what Lillian represented, of what it meant that his own monster had chosen her so completely, of what it said about the 3 centuries of iron control he'd spent convincing himself were strength rather than fear. He went to the kennel that night and stood at the observation gap and watched her sleep, curled against Varg's flank, her braids loose now, one hand resting in the coarse black fur, and said nothing, did nothing, stood in his corridor with his torch burning and his jaw set and the soul link warm and open in his chest, and thought about duty and control and all the things he'd built his kingship upon, until the torch burned to nothing and left him standing in the dark. Dawn arrived pale and cold, the way northern dawns do, without sentimentality. The courtyard had been arranged with the brisk efficiency that Mistress Thorne applied to all logistics. The stone cleared, the household staff assembled at the edges, the chopping block positioned with geometric precision in the center. 2 guards collected Lillian from the kennel corridor before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, and she went with them without fighting, because she was, still at her core, a practical person, and fighting 2 armed guards in a stone corridor with her hands bound was not a practical proposition. She looked calm. She did not feel calm. She felt the way the sky looks just before it goes green before gold. Honest and unbeautiful, not yet ready to be anything other than true. The courtyard filled slowly. Balthazar stood at the far end in his gray robes, hands folded, face arranged into the expression of someone performing a surgical necessity. Cora stood 3 people to his left in a pale dress, her chin at its usual angle. Leon stood on the steps of the great hall, armored and still, looking at the courtyard's center with the face he used at war. Lillian was walked to the block. She was thinking about Yarrow, about the specific resilience of it, how it came back every year no matter how hard the frost, before the first explosion hit the eastern wall. The sound was not like thunder, it was structural, seismic, a compression of air that preceded the crack of stone by half a second. The eastern wall of the Citadel's outer ring came apart in a cascade of black rock and mortar, and through the gap came riders, 12, 20, more behind them, in the red-dyed leather of the Crimson Fangs, the renegade pack that had been raiding the Northern Territory's borders for 3 seasons. At their head, on a gray horse, rode a man who wore Leon's jaw and Leon's brow, and 30 years' worth of carefully nurtured grievance in his eyes. Silas Todd.
Leon's younger brother, his father's second son, the man who had been passed over for the Alpha title on the grounds of temperament and had spent the intervening decades constructing an argument in blood and dark alliance for why the decision had been wrong.
He rode into the courtyard with the crimson fangs pouring in behind him and a silver-bound artifact hanging at his belt. A disk of pale, veined rock in a wrought silver cage pulsing with a cold, irregular light. And he looked at his brother on the steps and smiled, the way people smile when they have spent a very long time waiting for something. "Hello, Leon," he said. "I've brought your council a more immediate problem than a servant girl." What followed was not a battle so much as a controlled catastrophe. Leon's guards engaged the Crimson Fangs in the courtyard with the disciplined efficiency of soldiers who had trained for exactly this kind of interior breach, and Leon came off the steps with his sword drawn and his face gone completely to war. A different kind of stillness than the one he'd worn watching the execution preparations, this one alive and dangerous at the edges. Lillian's guards released her arms and drew their own weapons, which meant Lillian was standing beside the chopping block in the center of a courtyard that had become, in approximately 40 seconds, a significant emergency, with her hands still bound and no particular means of defending herself. She moved toward the wall. Practical. She almost made it. Silas came off his horse with the silver artifact in one hand and a blade in the other, and he was not interested in the guards or the battle lines or anything except the trajectory that took him directly to his brother. Leon turned to meet him, and they came together in the center of the courtyard with the impact of two things that have been building toward collision for decades. Trading blows with the focused, specific violence of people who know each other's tendencies, who grew up training in the same yards, who understand the other's rhythm at a level that bypasses thought. Silas was younger. Leon was 3 centuries of refined. For a time, it was even. Then Silas activated the artifact. The silver-bound lunar stone, Lillian recognized it in a flash of clarity, the stone her sister had stolen and planted in her room, now caged in silver and pulsing with something that had been done to it, something corrupting and cold, flared white-blue in Silas's hand, and Leon staggered. Through the soul link, Varg screamed, a frequency that Lillian felt in her back teeth, a sound from the lower corridor that hit the courtyard like a physical wave. The silver was a severing instrument, she understood suddenly, watching Leon's face go gray. It was designed to cut the soul link, to drive a wedge between king and beast, to leave Leon isolated from his own deepest power at the moment he most needed it. Leon went to one knee. Silas drove the blade home. Not to kill, not yet, she understood. He needed Leon alive to make the transfer of power legitimate, but the silver blade went into Leon's side, and Leon made a sound that was not kingly or armored or any of the things he had built himself to be. A sound that was simply a man in pain, and he went down onto the courtyard stone with one hand pressed against the wound, and his sword still gripped in the other, and his face going the particular white of silver poisoning, which moves fast. Lillian was already moving before she understood that she was moving. Her hands were still bound. She crossed the courtyard at a run, past a guard, past a riderless Crimson Fang horse, past Balthazar pressing himself against the great hall steps with his gray robes clutched around him, and she dropped to her knees on the stone beside Leon and pressed her bound hands against the wound, which was the only thing she could think to do, because she was a practical person and the bleeding needed pressure. "Don't," Leon said, which was not useful advice under the circumstances. "Be quiet," she said. She could feel the silver poison in the wound beneath her hands, not literally, not the way you feel heat or texture, but something adjacent to that, a wrongness, a place where something essential was being interrupted. She had felt it through Varg, she realized. She had spent 2 weeks with her hands in the soul link's edges, learning its texture through the beast's trust, and she knew what it felt like when it was open, and what it felt like when something was pushing against it, and this was the second thing. This was a door being forced shut. The light came without warning. It came from her hands first, silver white, not the cold blue silver of Silas's artifact, but something warmer, something that came from the same place the warmth in her chest had always come from, the same inexhaustible supply she'd spent her whole life giving away to frightened animals and frost-killed gardens and lonely beasts in the dark.
It spread up her arms. It spread through Leon's wound, and it did not simply seal the damage. It followed the soul link inward, chasing the silver poison along the connection between king and beast, burning it out the way sunlight burns out shadow. From the corridor, Varg howled, not in pain, in recognition. The chains, already broken, already insufficient, fell away entirely as Varg came through the kennel gate into the courtyard, and the light from Lillian's hands and the light from Varg's amber eyes, suddenly blazing white rather than amber, found each other across the courtyard and merged with an audible physical concussion that stopped every person in that courtyard where they stood. Leon gasped, a full, deep breath, the breath of someone who has been held underwater and has broken the surface. And then he rose. Not the way an injured man rises, carefully, testing weight, the way something that has been separated from itself rises when it is made whole, all at once, complete, altered in some quality that was immediately visible to everyone watching, even if none of them could have named exactly what they were seeing. The armor he wore looked different. He looked different, larger in some way that had nothing to do with size, the way a completed thing is larger than the sum of its parts. Varg came to stand beside him, not behind him, beside him. Silas, 3 yards away with his silver artifact still pulsing in his hand, took one look at his brother's face and knew that something fundamental had changed in the arithmetic of this fight. He raised the artifact. Leon raised his hand, and the unity light, Lillian's light, the beast whisperer's gift, now moving through both of them simultaneously, extinguished the artifact's cold pulse as simply and completely as a hand closing over a candle flame. The silver casing cracked. The corrupted lunar stone went dark. What followed was brief and without ambiguity.
The courtyard was quiet by midday. The Crimson Fangs who could flee had fled. Those who couldn't had surrendered. Silas knelt in the center of the courtyard with his wrists bound in iron. Real iron, not silver. Leon had specified this. His gray horse gone, his dark alliance collapsed. 30 years of grievance arriving at the destination all such journeys arrive at eventually. Balthazar stood near the Great Hall steps, his gray robes somewhat less immaculate than they'd been at dawn, his hands no longer folded. He looked at Lillian with an expression that had traveled, over the course of the morning, from condemnation through shock and appeared to be arriving, reluctantly, at something resembling recalibration. He did not apologize. Men like Balthazar did not apologize. But he bowed his head when she looked at him, and for Balthazar, Lillian understood, that was seismic. Cora had disappeared sometime during the fighting. No one had seen her go. This did not surprise Lillian. Her sister had always known which direction the tide was moving before it moved, and had always been ready to redirect accordingly. She would surface somewhere, eventually, in a pale dress with her chin at its angle, explaining why everything had worked out exactly as she'd intended. Lillian found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not have a great deal of energy left for anger about it. The garden, the stone, the exile, all of it felt like it had happened to a version of herself that had not yet learned what she now knew, and that girl deserved her compassion more than her sister deserved her fury. She was sitting on the courtyard steps, her wrists finally unbound, rewrapping her hands where the stone had scraped them, when the footsteps stopped in front of her. She looked up. Leon Todd stood before her in his dark plate armor with the fur-lined cloak and the crowned wolf sigil, and the face that was etched with 3 centuries of iron authority, and something else now, something new in the architecture of it, an openness, a visibility, as though a layer of stone had been removed, and whatever lived beneath had decided, finally, to stop pretending it wasn't there. He was looking at her the way he had looked at the soul link on the nights he'd stood in the corridor with his torch burning, with the specific attention of someone encountering something they don't have adequate language for yet and are not going to pretend otherwise. Varg sat beside him, enormous and black and warm-eyed, and thumped his tail once against the courtyard stone. Leon lowered himself to one knee. Not the way an injured man kneels, not the way a diplomat kneels, performing the geometry of political theater.
He went down with the deliberate, full-weight intention of someone who has decided that this is the truest thing he can offer. And that truth matters more in this moment than whatever a king is supposed to look like. The courtyard was not empty. Mistress Thorne stood at the great hall door with her hands at her sides and her iron-gray composure doing something unusual at the edges of her expression. Wrath had emerged from the battle lines. The household staff had gathered. What remained of the Elder Council stood in their gray robes, all of them watching. "Your name," Leon said, quietly, just for her, though in the silence of the courtyard it carried, "is not a servant's name. It is not a scapegoat's name." A pause, and in the pause was 300 years of a man discovering that the thing he had walled out of himself was the only thing that had ever truly belonged there. "You walked into the darkest thing in my kingdom, and you treated it like it mattered, like he mattered." His jaw moved. "You saw the man inside the monster before I remembered he existed." Lillian looked at the Alpha King of the Northern Territories on one knee in his own courtyard, and the enormous black wolf beside him, whose amber eyes were soft and whose tail was making its patient, faithful rhythm against the stone, and she thought about Yarrow and the way things that should not survive a frost come back every year regardless, and the green light before the gold. "I saw someone who was lonely. That's all. It wasn't complicated." It was the most complicated thing anyone has ever done in 3 centuries of this kingdom, and you did it in 2 weeks with a bucket and some comfrey. Varg thumped his tail again. Mistress Thorne made a sound from the doorway that Lillian had never heard from her before, short, involuntary, and suspiciously close to a laugh. She covered it immediately with a cough and rearranged her face into its working configuration, but Lillian filed it away because some things are worth keeping. Leon rose from his knee. He looked at her for a moment in the pale midday light, assessing the way he assessed everything, but differently now, without the armor of assessment behind it. "The A. Fowler name has been cleared. Whatever the Elder Council put in the record will be corrected, publicly." A brief glance towards Balthazar, who straightened his robes and gave a small, tight nod. "Your sister's role in it will also be recorded, publicly." "She'll explain it away. She's very good at that." "She can try, but the record will say what it says." He paused, and something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same neighboring territory. "I would like you to stay, not in the kennels." Lillian looked at him. "Where then?" "Somewhere with better drainage," he said. "You were not wrong about the courtyard." She laughed at that, a real one, the same kind that had rung off the kennel walls like a dropped coin in a cathedral, and she saw something happen to Leon's face when he heard it, some internal wall deciding, quietly and without ceremony, that it had served its purpose and could stand down. Varg put his great head against her knee. The courtyard was still, the northern ridge beyond the broken eastern wall going gold in the midday light, and Lillian put her hand in the familiar coarse black fur and felt the soul link warm and open and present, felt the man and the beast occupying the same space with the ease of things that had finally stopped fighting each other, and thought that this, all of this, the bucket and the comfrey and the broken chains and the silver light she hadn't known she was carrying, had not been complicated at all. She had simply refused to see a monster when there was a soul worth knowing standing right in front of her. It turned out that was enough. It turned out, in the end, that was everything.